I'm going to count down all of the full-length records by eccentric and metaphysical black metal entity Blut Aus Nord, which is of course the one-man project of the insane French aestheticist Vince Val. Other musicians may have contributed to Blut Aus Nord over the years, but I don't believe this. I think it's the highly personal work and vision of Vince Val exclusively, and in many ways it's not an easy task to complete this countdown because there are two very distinct sides to the Blut Aus Nord catalogue, which we'll get into as I go through the list. But before I get to the full lengths, there are some splits and DPs that I definitely want to comment on, and I should say that I do own all of these releases on CD, with the exception of 3, because as far as I can tell you can't get them, and 2 of them are actually splits and have the same 3 Blut Aus Nord tracks on them, and that is Dissociated, Human Junction and Decorporation. And these 3 tracks are definitely worth listening to. You can find them very easily. And not to jump the gun, but they're only about 10 minutes long and they hint at 3 major Blut Aus Nord records, which are The Mystical Beast of Rebellion, MoRT, and The Work Which Transforms God. You'll hear traces of all of those in these 3 split release tracks, so worth seeking out. And we've also got splits called Triunity and Codex Obscura Nomina, and I favour Codex Obscura of these 2, especially for the track Resonances, the second track, which goes very heavy on the more dissonant sounds Vince Val likes to deploy, and Infravoices Ensemble has a swagger about it that I appreciate. But the 3 Triunity tracks are also very high quality if you enjoy the progressive industrial edge of Blut Aus Nord, which everybody does of course, so worth picking up both of these splits. I'm not mentioning the other 2 bands on these splits by the way, no time for that, but that's the 4 split releases addressed. And on the EP side, and this is actually a very interesting set of records, we've got the 3-piece suite of what once was Liber releases, which are very much on the nightmarishly atmospheric side of Blut Aus Nord, the dominant side of the catalogue. And this is mostly very fast and pitch black industrial black metal that has a very mysterious edge, because there's very little in the way of explanation on these releases, and they're not very long, they're about half an hour each. And in my mind there was very little fanfare around these releases when they came out, they just sort of appeared, and Liber 2 is tragically the other release I haven't actually got on CD. I think there's a story around why it didn't get a CD release. But briefly, Liber 1 has 2 particularly brilliant tracks, which is track 1 and especially track 4, which really stood out for me from the very first listen. But Liber 2 and Liber 3 are probably stronger overall, and if you did want to evaluate them, I could understand why either Liber 2 or Liber 3 is your favourite, but I'll give the edge to Liber 3 just because I bought the t-shirt, so I'm more emotionally invested in that one. But a brilliant set of releases that I really think went undervalued and under the radar, but are essential listening. And there's a 3-track EP called Debamore MoRT, which is a commemorative release for the band's label, Debamore MoRT, for their 100th release. It's 2 original tracks on the industrial side, plus a cover version of a Pitch Shifter track. I do quite like Pitch Shifter, but I think Vince Val can make these types of track all day long, so not the most essential release in reality, but any Blut Aus Nord fan will enjoy it and should probably check it out. But then, finally, Thematic Emanations of Archetypal Multiplicity, and this was the first Blut Aus Nord CD I bought, and I thought it was amazing, like nothing else I'd ever heard, and certainly not what I was expecting. I thought I was getting a black metal record, but it's pure black atmosphere in slow motion with all the world-bending excesses that the band are really known for now, and I loved everything about it. I love the title and the subtitle, however written it is. I love the artwork, I love the whole aesthetic of this EP, and I later found that it was originally supposed to be part of a conceptual split with the Axis of Perdition, and I love the Axis of Perdition, but this release instantly got me hooked on Blut Aus Nord, and I would actually put it as one of the best Blut Aus Nord releases full stop, not just for an EP. It is required listening and absorbing from the very first track. But onto the full lengths, and there are 13 at the time of recording, and I want to keep this snappy and under 15 minutes, so let's get straight to it. And at number 13, and let's bear in mind that these are all great albums, there is no bad music here, but at number 13 it's going to be the first Memoria Vetusta record, Fathers of the Icy Age, and this is quite conventional and melodic black metal in the classic 90s style, and every time I listen to it I think this is the time it's really going to click, but it never does. It immediately sounds beautiful with the opener Slaughter Day, which is close to breathtaking, but the tracks as you get further in are not memorable and distinctive enough, so it's fine to have it in the background because it's got this kind of dreamy and almost ethereal atmosphere, but very little in the way of hooks. So as competent and as flawlessly executed as it is, I'm still putting it in there at number 13, and maybe that's going to be controversial, but you know, I just call it as I see it. And then at number 12 it's going to be Odinist, The Destruction of Reason by Illumination, with that reference to the eye on the cover, one of Vince Val's other bands, The Eye. And there's a couple of very important notes here. The first is that context is very important. This came off the back of MoRT, which really pushed boundaries when it was released and was a huge artistic statement. And then Odinist just felt so safe, so I found it disappointing because it felt like a step backwards, not even a step sideways. There was a very distinct lack of adventure, which is one of my favourite things about Blut Aus Nord. So that's point number 1. But on the positive side, the title track Odinist is one of the best songs in the whole catalogue, so the album is perfectly fine to listen to generally, but then you've got this massive highlight in the middle, so worth playing the album for that song alone, and that's also why I've put it above Memoria Vetusta. That was the deciding factor. So number 12, it's Odinist. Then number 11, it's Memoria Vetusta 2, Dialogue with the Stars, and this is a very similar experience to Memoria Vetusta 1, but slightly more beautiful and a few more memorable passages, and overall a more dreamy experience. And I should again emphasise how flawless and sophisticated this is, but the songs still have a tendency to blend into each other, a couple of exceptions like maybe The Meditant. But I've had this album since it came out in 2009, so that's over a decade ago, and I will still have a hard time telling you which track I was listening to if you played a random 20 seconds. So another great album to have on in the background, but not an active listen, and not one I've ever recommended to anyone, so that's why it's going in there at number 11. Then number 10, it's MoRT, The Big Experiment, and I was extremely excited to get this one when it came out. And I remember the second track was released early. I got it on a Terrorizer CD, Terrorizer magazine, so track 2 was considered the catchy one, I guess. But this is about 45 minutes of walls melting weirdness that really reflects the extreme end of the experimental side of Blut Aus Nord. And I love that it exists, and I love seeing an artist pursue a vision to its uncompromising endpoint. But in practice, it's not the most replayable record in the band's oeuvre. It's amazing when you're in the mood, but there isn't much to grasp onto here. And what I would also say is that when I do listen to it, for me track 5 is the peak and has a beautiful second half and denouement. And I really only need one more track after that to bring it all back down, so it may be a bit long too for this type of material, but nevertheless an essential and an important Blut Aus Nord record, MoRT at number 10. Then number 9, I'm going with Ultima Thule, or Ultima Thulée, and I remember getting this album. I remember Candlelight reissuing this and the first Memoria Vetusta at the same time. This was 2005, and all I'd known at this point was the perspective-changing industrial black hole metal that Blut Aus Nord had been putting out, so I was surprised and a bit disappointed to hear music that was so similar to a lot of other music I'd heard. But Ultima Thulée was definitely a lot more interesting than Memoria Vetusta, and has some fantastic tracks on it, especially The Plane of Ida, track 2, and some of the interludes are very atmospheric. A touch of the Burzums about it in places as well. So an excellent debut and very recommended, Ultima Thulée at number 9. Then number 8, it's the birth, or the rebirth, of Blut Aus Nord with The Mystical Beast of Rebellion, the album that really set out the true sonic aesthetic of Blut Aus Nord and moved light years away from the second wave sound of the earlier releases. And it's really a shocking departure, essentially a relentless nightmare of uncompromising industrial yet atmospheric black metal, with microscopic variation between tracks except for one slower track towards the end. And it was the first time Vince Val had used one title for every track, The Fall, chapters 1 to 6, I guess to emphasise that the album is one thought subtly broken down into moments, and it's really where Vince Val distinguished himself as an artist rather than just a musician, and I love the boldness and the originality of the piece, and the only downside is there's too much silence in places, which to me hurts the momentum, and it's really too one-dimensional to put too far up the chart, but overall a grand statement of intent from which genius would follow. Then at number 7, it's Hallucinogen, the most recent release as at the time of recording, and it's fairly closely aligned with the Memoria Vetusta side of the catalogue, but it also touches on some of the more progressive elements of latter-day Blut Aus Nord, and a couple of things that really help it are firstly the outstanding opening track Nobis Nebulium, which is immediately catchy and demands many repeat spins, and I'd also say this album is dynamic and more accessible than a lot of Blut Aus Nord records, although it's closer to normal heavy metal in some places than most Blut Aus Nord albums, which isn't really what I'm looking for, especially from Blut Aus Nord, but overall a very good album that carves out its own place in the catalogue. Hallucinogen at number 7. Then number 6, it's Sect, our first entry from the 777 trilogy. And to be honest, it was exactly what I needed from Blut Aus Nord at this point, an instant return to the sound that I knew and loved the band for, but with a slightly more direct attack in some places and with plenty of variety and atmosphere. And the main reasons it's the lowest placed of the trilogy is because it doesn't really venture into territory Blut Aus Nord hadn't visited before, especially when the highlight track, track 2, is very reminiscent of a highlight from an album we haven't got to yet, and I'll leave you to figure out which track that is. And Sect also slightly meanders in the second half, which Blut Aus Nord are occasionally prone to do, if I'm honest. And I should also say that I was very struck by how much the end of track 1 sounds like the Thematic Emanations EP. But even with that said, Sect is still very much its own album and is going in there at number 6. Number 5, it's going to be Deus, Salutis, Meae, and for me this may be the only full length that isn't guilty of meandering at any point and is therefore a thoroughly satisfying listen from beginning to end, and it has always struck me as a warmer and a more accessible version of an album we haven't yet discussed. Again, you'll have to work out which work that might be, and it's a relatively short album for Blut Aus Nord at just under 35 minutes, which really helps with that tighter, more focused feel. So it doesn't do anything we haven't heard from Blut Aus Nord before, but it is an excellent version of it and has killer tracks all the way through, so I don't really want to pick out highlights. But I will say it starts with the brilliant 1-2 of Coria Macabiorum, and then Impious, with those signature squalling guitarists at the outset that I always enjoy. And I really do think it has a similar structure to another of the band's works, Wink. So this is a great album and might even be a good introduction for a newcomer. Then number 4, it's our second entry from the 777 triptych. It's the Desanctification, which slows it all down for a heavier and a more industrial stomp. around these meditatively and spiritually soft guitar tones. And just to say a word about the trilogy, it's considered a single piece of work, every track is called Epitome, and I am conscious of this when I listen to it, but my actual experience is that it's 3 separate albums. They were all released on different dates, and I've never listened to them all as one experience. I don't really need to, I know the albums inside out and I can understand them as a journey, but to be a genuinely single experience they would have needed to be released on the same day in the same package. That's just a brief thought about 777 as a trilogy. But in any case, the Desanctification is a very distinctive and compelling record that starts off with a low key track before track 2 starts to really drag you into this world, and the album is really built around the drum patterns rather than riffs, and the real gold here is track 5 but then track 6, Epitome 12, which is a stroke of absolute genius, and it's really the guitars decorating the central drum pattern as the song develops. It's all very magical and completely unlike any other Blut Aus Nord track, and the album generally seems to me to be a subtly mesmerising experience, which is why it's going in there at number 4. Number 3, perhaps surprisingly given my analysis so far, is going to be Memoria Vetusta 3, Saturnian Poetry, the jewel of the Memoria Vetustas for my money, and this is much more luscious and rich, and just generally a more consistently enjoyable and rounded experience than the first 2 MVs, with a handful of memorable tracks rather than just dreamy atmospheres, and a genuine stunner at the end with Clarissa Lundi Lumina, which is actually the most straightforward track and the one that kept bringing me back for those early spins. And don't underestimate the allure of the gorgeous Necro Lord artwork and packaging, which makes this a nice album just to have in your hands. So I immediately found this Memoria Vetusta a more satisfying listen than the first 2, and easily competes with the best entries from the metaphysical side of the catalogue, apples and oranges though that comparison may be, although ultimately it is still a traditional piece of second wave black metal, as opposed to an unsettling journey into the mind of a demented genius, but certainly good enough to go in there at number 3. Then number 2, and we finally reach what for me are the genuinely elite records in the Blut Aus Nord catalogue, and the first one's going to be Cosmosophy, the finale to the trilogy, and this is a gorgeous album that again sounds like nothing else Blut Aus Nord has put out, and it's soothing in a transcendental way. It feels personal and almost introspective in a sense, and it's only 5 tracks, and the first one is like the Desanctification because it's low key but introduces the sound and the vibe of the album from the first sublime notes really. But tracks 3 and 4 are the real treasures, with these clean and classy vocals, a million miles away from the inhuman retching of the mystical beast for example, but still absolutely identifiable as Blut Aus Nord, especially if you follow the band's whole career. And the final track, Epitome 18, is epic enough to finish both this album and indeed the whole trilogy. It does have that scope, so ultimately a triumphant end to the cycle, Cosmosophy at number 2. Which leaves The Work Which Transforms God as the number 1 Blut Aus Nord album, and I can't overstate how hard my jaw hit the floor the first time I heard The Choir of the Dead. I think it might have a bigger impact if you've never heard the band before, but I'd only heard Thematic Emanations, so I was even more shocked because I had false expectations, and it's stunning anyway for the first couple of minutes, just the originality and the shock of the sound. But when it breaks down halfway through, that's when you realise you've entered another world, and then the next track, Axis, is actually faster and even more chaotic, and the Supreme Abstract follows not long after on a similar vibe. But then you've got the pivotal track at the centre of the album, Our Blessed Frozen Cells, which turns the album into a monument, along of course with Procession of the Dead Clowns, the awesome closer that sounds like the credits to an apocalyptic blockbuster, an incredibly impressive and effective finale. I really can't praise this album highly enough, and I do consider it beyond what most artists could even dream up, never mind execute. So there's no doubt for me, The Work Which Transforms God is in there at number 1 as the best and indeed the defining Blut Aus Nord album. So that's it, that's my countdown of the best Blut Aus Nord albums. I hope you liked it, and thank you for listening, and I will be back soon with more videos.